Hi, so I wanted to start talking a little bit more about our next topic, which is talking about populations and population density when we're talking about ecology, just talking as far as populations in general and how they function within the environment. So, one of the first things that you'll want to consider is what is a population if we're talking about studying them. So, if you think back to our different ecological levels that we talked about, a population has to do with several different members of one particular species. So, even though it is a lot of individuals, they are in the same area, at the same place, in the same time frame. So, again, we're talking about everything that's maybe more current as opposed to something that was 10 years ago. So a population has to do with those factors. And remember that they're all members of the same species. So why would studying populations be important? Take a little time to consider that, consider why do ecologists take the time to study these populations? And let me introduce you to some of the calculations that we look at and some of the terms that we look at for populations. So, one of the first things that we think about is population density. So, when we talk about density, again, we're describing something that'll be basically described by a mathematical equation. Density of a population is the number of individuals per unit area or volume. So, as you can see here in the photo example, we have someone who's doing a survey on a group of fish. So, they would be looking at the number of individuals per unit of volume. So, they may survey a particular part, in this case of an ocean or reef area. They may determine that it's so many liters or so many gallons, and then they're going to count the number of individuals of a particular species in that area. You could do the same thing when you're talking about land animals, usually per unit of area. You start talking about square miles. If you have someone who's researching animals that live in a field or in a forest, they usually survey a certain area of square miles and they count a certain number of individuals within that area. So another concept that we talk a little bit about with populations is dispersion of populations. This is the arrangement of the individuals within their population. Again, when we think about different types of organisms, how close and far away they are from one another is variable depending on the species. So the three terms that we look at for the different types of dispersion are even, clumped, and random. So if we think about even distribution, let me move my little video down here for a sec. This would be more what we're kind of thinking about, like this population of storks that we're looking at here with our nests. So they are all together. We can see that it's a group that they are together, but they all want a little bit of space from one another. A structure like this is what we call a rookery, where there are lots of parents that are attending to their offspring. So it's tough if they're too close together. Again, especially with birds, with the way that they defecate or go to the bathroom, they may go to the bathroom on one another if they're too close together. So if they're spread out a little bit, if they have a little bit of space from one another, it helps them to basically feel comfortable inside of their environment, have all the space that they need, but still be close enough together that if they need to get into contact to one another, or if they are all alerting each other about a predator, you're still close enough to be able to manage that. Move my video back up. So clumped is another one that we talk about. Clumped would be like this group of musk oxen over here. If we think about musk oxen in their environment, again, we can see from the picture that it's a cold environment. They stay really close together in part to stay warm, but also to protect one another. Musk oxen are known for creating this kind of defense where it's just a wall or a circle of individuals protecting the calves, which are usually in toward the middle, and then the horns are all out on the edges. So if there are wolves or any other predators that are trying to take the babies, they'll have a very hard time doing it. Again, herd animals like this, it's part of their strategy to stay close together, to protect one another, and in this case, to keep one another warm. Random is probably the hardest dispersion to describe because it doesn't make a lot of sense to us as people. But random usually has to do with animals and plants and microorganisms that can't really control where their populations go to. So the dandelions are here as that example. When you think about dandelion seeds in the summer, when you blow on them and they start distributing everywhere, where they go just depends on where the wind blows. They aren't settled into a specific spot. So this is why you'll see dandelions in lots of different areas because they're just spread at random. Same thing goes for lots of animals that live in the ocean and aren't strong enough to swim against the current. The water just takes them wherever they're going to go. They don't have any control over it. So population growth rate is another mathematical equation that we look at when we start talking about populations. So the growth rate is equal to the number of births minus the number of deaths. So again, if we're thinking, for instance, about like this population of bees, if you're taking care of a bunch of bees, we're not counting the individuals that are here in the picture. But during, let's say, one total year, we would talk about how many individuals were born and how many individuals died, on the other hand. So if you had 20 bee larvae or baby bees born, and you had about 10 that died, you would know that there is a difference between the two of them. So you would take the 20 births minus the 10 deaths, and you'd get 10. It would be a positive growth rate. You basically increased your population by 10 individuals. So these numbers can be positive, negative, or 0. It just has to depend on how the population fluctuated. So here we have a few specific examples talking about these different types of population growth rates and thinking about what does each one mean. So if we were looking at a population of mice and we noticed that there were more births than there were deaths, we would say that their growth rate is positive. That's what this means in this case. This is pretty typical for rodent populations because they have lots of babies very quickly. So it's likely that you'll see a positive growth rate in populations like that. If we start looking at whales, on the other hand, we might talk about if this population's growth rate is negative, what does that mean? So if we think about whales, again, if we're looking at the number of babies here in the picture, there's only one. Whales only have one offspring, and it takes them a very long time to have that offspring. Whales are also in a lot of trouble right now between whaling and pollution in the water, so it may be more likely that you see a negative growth rate in the population. The number of deaths outweighed the number of births. So if there are more deaths than births in a population, that's what this means. The population growth rate is negative at that point. And then finally, if we say that a population's growth rate is 0, what does that mean? So we're looking here at this population of coyotes, and this is actually a phenomenon that we see very frequently with coyote populations. If the population growth rate is 0, it literally means that there were as many births as there were deaths. So if the coyote population had 5 births, 5 pups, it might have also had 5 deaths, 5 individuals that died for one reason or another. When people have done pest control programs with coyotes, they notice that the numbers don't really fluctuate that much. The more coyotes that are killed, there seems to be a response biologically to where they produce more offspring, and if the population is pretty stable, they don't have as many offspring. So they keep their numbers in balance. They keep that population growth rate pretty much to 0. So that's one of the main things that I want you to understand again from this is talking about population growth rate, number of births minus the number of deaths. That's one equation that you want to think of. The other equation, think about population density, the number of individuals divided by the space that they're living in, either like square feet or volume like liters or gallons. Those are the main types of calculations I want you to consider. So I hope that this video was helpful for understanding.